I came home late on a Tuesday night, expecting to hear gravel crunch under my tires, the familiar sound I had heard for years every time I turned onto my land. Instead, my truck rolled smoothly over fresh black asphalt. I slowed to a stop, my headlights washing over bright yellow speed bumps, crisp white lines, and 3 brand new signs that made my stomach sink. HOA PRO. Then I saw her. Brenda Whitmore, the HOA head, standing right at the edge of my property, with a clipboard tucked under her arm and a smile that felt practiced. Like she had been waiting for this moment. She handed me an invoice for $12,400 and told me I should be thanking her. According to her, the HOA had fixed my ugly old road and boosted everyone's property value overnight. That road wasn't theirs. It never had been. My grandfather built it decades before the HOA even existed, engineered properly, surveyed, permitted, and recorded in county records. I had every deed and document to prove it. Brenda waved all of that away. She said standards had changed. She said the neighborhood had evolved. She said I didn't get a say anymore. What she didn't know was that I spent my entire career solving problems without raising my voice. I document, I wait, and when I act, it's final, because 72 hours later, 58 driveways were completely empty. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Before any of this blew up, my life was simple in the best possible way. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm a retired military engineer, and I live on a piece of land that's been in my family longer than most of the houses around me have existed. 3 quiet acres just outside what's now called Ridgeway Pines. When my grandfather passed, he left me the property and, with it, the one thing that would later cause all the trouble. The private access road. That road wasn't some makeshift dirt path. My grandfather built it the right way, back when he still believed in over-engineering everything. He had it professionally surveyed, permitted through the county, and recorded in black and white legal language that never expired. It was designed to handle heavy loads, proper drainage, clean grading, the kind of road you build when you plan on it lasting longer than you do. After I inherited the land, I maintained it myself. Gravel, grading, snow removal. Every receipt, every maintenance record neatly filed away without me even realizing how important they would become. Back then, the land around me was open. Fields, trees, quiet mornings. I could step outside and hear nothing but wind and birds. That was the deal. That was why I stayed. Then Ridgeway Pines arrived. One year it was survey flags and bulldozers. The next, it was rows of identical houses, shiny mailboxes, and people who looked at my place like it was unfinished business. Along with the houses came the homeowners association. New rules, new signs, new sense of authority that didn't exist the year before. I paid them no attention because legally I didn't have to. My property predated the development. I wasn't part of the association. I never signed anything, and I had zero interest in joining. That's when I met Brenda Whitmore. She introduced herself like she was doing me a favor. Clipboard in hand, perfect smile. Eyes already cataloging everything she didn't like. She glanced at my work truck first, then at my shop, then back at me. "This is a family neighborhood," she said, like she was explaining something obvious. "We try to keep things looking nice." At first, it was just comments. Little remarks that could almost pass as friendly if you didn't know better. Suggestions about where I parked my truck. Questions about whether I planned to clean up my equipment. Casual mentions of how much easier things would be if I joined the HOA. I told her calmly that my land wasn't part of it. She smiled and nodded like she heard me, but her eyes said otherwise. Over the next few months, the comments turned into notes. Not official notices, Just slips of paper left on my gate or tucked under my windshield wiper. Observations about appearances. Concerns about community standards. Gentle reminders that Ridgeway Pines had expectations. I ignored them. Then came the friendly conversations. She'd show up while I was working, always with that clipboard. Always blocking just enough of my path that I had to stop what I was doing. She'd mention how other residents had concerns. How my truck didn't fit the aesthetic. How noise carried in a growing neighborhood. Each time I explained the same thing. My property was excluded. The road was private. The HOA had no authority here. That's when her tone shifted. She stopped pretending it was a misunderstanding and started acting like it was temporary defiance. Like I was a problem that would eventually correct itself. She talked about community growth and changing standards, as if time alone could rewrite recorded deeds. At one meeting I didn't even attend, I later found out she'd referred to my road as shared access. That word stuck with me, shared. It wasn't true, but it told me exactly how she was thinking. I tried one last time to shut it down cleanly. I printed copies of my property documents, the original survey, the recorded easement, the exclusion language. I handed them to her myself. She flipped through them quickly, barely reading, then handed them back. "Things evolve," she said. "Paper doesn't always keep up." I told her paper was exactly what the law followed. That's when she smiled again, slower this time, smaller. "We'll see," she said. At the time, I thought it was just a power trip. An HOA head annoyed that there was one homeowner she couldn't order around. I went back to my routine. Work, home, quiet evenings. What I didn't realize was that while I was living my life, Brenda wasn't letting it go. She wasn't arguing anymore. She was planning. Once Brenda realized I wasn't going to fold, the pressure stopped being subtle. That's when the letters started. At first, they looked official enough to make most people nervous. HOA letterhead, formal language, notice of violation, stamped across the top. The problem was, none of the violations actually applied to me. Complaints about parking on HOA streets, even though my truck was on my own land. Notices about unapproved exterior modifications to structures the HOA didn't control. Warnings about maintenance standards that weren't in any covenant I'd ever signed. I didn't respond. I didn't call. I didn't argue. Then the county complaints began. Inspectors showed up asking about noise levels, zoning compliance, commercial activity. Every single visit ended the same way. They checked the records, looked at my permits, and left shaking their heads. One of them actually apologized for wasting my time. Another muttered something about someone with too much free time. That's when the neighbors started talking to me quietly. Not publicly. Not in front of Brenda. Just quick conversations when no one else was around. A guy walking his dog mentioned she asked him how often he drove on my road. A woman across the way asked if I'd given the HOA permission to use it. Someone else told me Brenda had been taking photos of traffic coming in and out of my property. The same phrase kept coming up. "She's obsessed with your road." I still tried to be reasonable. When Brenda announced an HOA meeting to discuss infrastructure concerns, I showed up. I figured maybe sunlight would fix whatever nonsense she was brewing. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, packed with folding chairs and residents who looked tired after long workdays. Brenda stood at the front, clipboard in hand, already in control of the room. She didn't mention me at first. She talked about growth, about safety, about how Ridgeway Pines needed to think long-term. Then she pulled up a map on a projector. And there it was, my road, highlighted, labeled as shared access infrastructure. I felt the room shift. People leaned forward, heads tilted. Confused murmurs rippled through the chairs. I raised my hand. Brenda ignored it. She went on about wear and tear. about how community vehicles had used the road for years, about how shared use created shared responsibility. She never once said my name, but every word was aimed directly at me. Finally, one of the board members spoke up, an older man who looked genuinely puzzled. "I thought that road was private," he said. "Didn't it exist before the development?" Brenda smiled like she'd been waiting for that question. "Well," she said, "it's complicated." That was the moment I knew something was wrong, because it wasn't complicated at all. It was private. It always had been. And if the board was confused, it meant they hadn't been told the truth. I stood up and spoke calmly. I explained the history, the survey, the recorded easement, the fact that my property wasn't part of the HOA and never had been. I offered to provide documentation. Brenda didn't argue with me directly. She thanked me for my perspective and said the board would review the matter. The meeting moved on, but the damage was done. After that night, the harassment became coordinated. The notices increased. The language sharpened. References to community usage started appearing in writing. I received a letter claiming my road had been used openly by residents for an extended period of time, as if repetition alone could turn a lie into truth. Behind the scenes, Brenda was busy. A neighbor showed me a revised boundary map she'd circulated informally, one that quietly absorbed my road into HOA lines that didn't match county records. Another neighbor forwarded an email where Brenda talked about establishing long-term access rights for the community. Not asking, establishing. That word stuck with me. I considered confronting her directly, marching up with documents and shutting it down face to face. But years in the military taught me something important. You don't interrupt someone while they're making mistakes. Instead, I started documenting. Every letter went into a folder. Every email got saved. I photographed the signs she installed near my road, even though they had no authority there yet. I logged dates and times of county visits. I wrote down names of inspectors and what they said. When neighbors talked to me, I asked them to repeat things in writing. Casual texts became evidence. Friendly warnings became timelines. I ordered copies of every relevant county record, surveys, deeds, easements, historical filings. I matched them against the OA's documents and started noticing inconsistencies. Lines that didn't match. Descriptions that relied on vague language instead of measurements. Brenda wasn't just being aggressive. She was laying groundwork. She was building a paper trail that said my road belonged to everyone, hoping no one would ever compare it to the real one. And the most important thing I noticed, she never sent anything by certified mail. She never asked for a signature. She never involved an attorney. She was testing how far she could go before I pushed back. So I didn't. I smiled when I saw her. I stayed polite. I thanked inspectors for their time. I let her believe the pressure was working. Because while she was busy rewriting reality, I was quietly preserving it. And I had a feeling she was about to make a move she couldn't undo. I was out of town when it happened. 3 days on a short contract job. Nothing unusual. I left my property the same way I always did, rolling over gravel I'd personally maintained for years, never imagining that I'd come back to something unrecognizable. The first sign something was wrong was my phone. Missed calls, texts from neighbors I barely knew. One message just said, "Call me." Now, when I finally reached someone, their voice dropped the moment they realized it was me. "They paved it," he said. "Ethan, they paved your road." I thought he meant part of it, a patch. Maybe the entrance where HOA traffic occasionally cut across despite my signs. I told myself there was no way they'd crossed that line. I was wrong. When I drove back in late that evening, my headlights hit smooth black asphalt stretching the entire length of my private access road. Fresh paint gleamed under the beams. Bright yellow speed bumps rose where my grading used to be. Reflective white striping cut clean lines through land the HOA had no claim to, and there they were, new metal signs bolted into the ground. HOA Party. Rusadita CCESONLY. I parked and got out slowly, my boots sticking slightly to the still, curing surface. The smell of fresh asphalt hung heavy in the air. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't rushed. This was planned, scheduled, paid for. By the time I reached my house, an envelope was waiting on my door. Inside was an invoice, $12,400. Paving, striping, signage. Labor, due immediately. The next morning, Brenda Whitmore showed up like she'd been waiting all night. She didn't apologize. She didn't hesitate. She didn't pretend this was a misunderstanding. She stood on my land, pointed at the road, and spoke like she was explaining something to a child. The community voted to improve shared infrastructure, she said. You're welcome, by the way. Property values just went up. I told her the road was private. She smiled and said it's used to be. According to her, years of open community use had transferred rights to the HOA. She said the law recognized something called implied access. She said the paperwork was already being updated. She said resistance would only make things harder. Then she escalated. She mentioned liens. She mentioned towing unauthorized vehicles parked on HOA property. She mentioned fines for noncompliance if I altered or damaged community improvements. Every word was delivered calmly, confidently, like she'd rehearsed it in the mirror. I asked her who authorized the work. She said the board. I asked her where the vote records were. She said they existed. I asked her which attorney advised her. She said they didn't need one. That's when it clicked. This wasn't a power trip anymore. This wasn't ignorance or ego or some HOA head flexing authority she didn't have. This was theft. They didn't ask permission. They didn't notify me. They didn't even attempt a legal process. They altered my property, asserted ownership, and tried to bill me afterward, all while I was away and unable to stop it. Premeditated, coordinated, deliberate. I went inside and pulled every document I had. Original deeds, surveys, easements, county filings older than the entire development. Nothing had changed. Nothing had ever granted them access rights. There was no ambiguity, no gray area. I called the county. They hadn't approved any boundary changes. I called the permitting office. No permits had been issued for work on my parcel. I called a paving contractor I trusted. He laughed when I told him what they'd done, then stopped laughing when he realized I was serious. He told me, flatly, that no legitimate company would touch private land without signed authorization from the owner. That meant one thing. Brenda had convinced a crew they were working on HOA-owned property. Or worse, she knew exactly what she was doing and assumed I'd back down once the asphalt was down and the bill was in my hand. That night, cars started using the road like it belonged to them. Residents drove slower, carefully navigating the speed bumps, nodding politely like nothing had changed. A few even waved, not out of malice, out of ignorance. They'd been told this was community property now, and they believed it. That was the most dangerous part, because lies spread best when they look official. I stood at the edge of my land and watched headlights pass, each one reinforcing Brenda's narrative. Each car was another silent witness to a crime they didn't realize they were participating in. Brenda thought she'd won because she moved fast. She thought asphalt made ownership real. She thought paperwork could be fixed later, once resistance collapsed. What she didn't understand was that she'd just handed me the cleanest case of trespass, fraud, and unauthorized improvement I'd ever seen. She didn't just cross a line, she paved over it. And in doing so, she turned an annoyance into a legal nightmare she couldn't talk her way out of. I didn't confront her again. I didn't tear up the signs. I didn't block the road. I went quiet, because at that moment, I stopped thinking like a neighbor and started thinking like an engineer who knew exactly how systems fail when pushed past their limits, and Brenda had just pushed hers too far. I didn't rush anything after that. That's what Brenda expected. Anger, threats, maybe a dramatic confrontation she could spin to the board. Instead, I went quiet. No calls, no emails, no signs pulled down. I let the road stay exactly the way they'd left it. Then I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Laura Hensley, a property rights attorney I'd worked with years earlier on an unrelated easement dispute. Laura doesn't bluff and she doesn't miss details. When I emailed her the documents, deeds, surveys, the invoice, photos of the signage, she called me back in under an hour. Her first words were, "They really did this without your consent." I told her everything. By the time I finished, she wasn't asking questions anymore. She was listing violations, trespass, unauthorized improvements, fraudulent assessment, misrepresentation of ownership, improper use of association funds. Then she paused. "Ethan," she said, "do you know what you still have?" I said I assumed my road. She said, "No, you have control." The second call was to Mark Alvarez, a state transportation engineer and an old friend from my military days. Mark had helped design access systems for everything from rural developments to disaster response corridors. If there was a technical angle to this, he'd see it. I sent him the same packet. He drove out the next morning. We walked the road together slowly while residents passed us, glancing over like we were inspectors. Mark crouched at the edges, examined the grading, measured setbacks, photographed the signage placements. When we finished, he leaned against his truck and shook his head. "They didn't just pave it," he said. "They reclassified it in practice without authority. That's a massive problem." Between Laura's legal review and Mark's technical assessment, 3 things became crystal clear. First, the HOA had absolutely zero ownership claim, no easement, no access agreement, no historical right. Community use didn't matter because it was never granted and never recorded. Second, every assessment Brenda issued was illegal. You can't bill a private landowner for unauthorized work performed without consent, especially when that work alters the land. And third, the part Brenda never bothered to check, as the sole owner of a private access road, I retained full termination authority. 72 hours notice. That was it. No appeals, no HO override, no board vote that could touch it. If the owner withdrew access after proper notice, any continued use became willful trespass. Mark looked at me and smiled, slow and careful. "She handed you the switch," he said. "And she flipped it herself." Brenda thought paving the road locked it into community status. In reality, she'd done the opposite. By investing HOA funds into private property without authorization, she'd strengthened my position and weakened hers. Laura drafted the notices that afternoon, clean, professional, unemotional. They cited recorded deeds, county parcel numbers, state access statutes, termination clauses. Each one ended the same way: 72 hours from receipt, all non-owner access would be revoked. No threats, no insults, just facts. Mark prepared a technical summary explaining why the road could not legally function as shared infrastructure without formal transfer, environmental review, and state approval, none of which existed. We didn't send anything yet. We waited. Because timing mattered. Brenda was still telling residents the road was HOA property. People were using it daily, believing her. The board hadn't seen the real documents. The county hadn't been notified of the unauthorized work. The towing threats were still verbal. The longer she leaned into the lie, the more damage she did to herself. I installed discrete cameras along my property line, not to intimidate, just to document every car, every sign, every conversation. Laura advised me not to warn the HOA ahead of time. Let them commit, she said. You already have enough, but every additional act after notice strengthens your case. When the notices went out, they went everywhere. Certified mail to every board member, email copies with read receipts, hand-delivered packets to the HOA management office. Brenda received hers last. I watched from my porch as she read it. Her smile didn't vanish immediately. It faded slowly, like someone realizing the ground under them wasn't solid anymore. She flipped pages faster. Her posture stiffened. She looked up at the road, then back at the paper. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She just learned that asphalt doesn't create ownership. Paper does. And she'd paved a private road she now had exactly 72 hours to stop using. Quietly, legally, and without realizing it, Brenda Whitmore had handed me total control. All I had to do now was wait. Brenda had always had a way of making tension feel like it could snap at any second, but that morning, it was different. There was a sharp edge in her voice that made even the usual board meetings feel like a storm about to break. She marched up my driveway like she owned the street, her boots clicking against the asphalt, every step heavy with intent. I watched, silent, as she gestured to my truck, marking it with warnings that made it look like evidence in some imagined emergency. Her words came fast, clipped, and full of authority: emergency, violation, immediate action. She spoke as if the power she claimed existed outside the rules of law, as if the HOA bylaws were mere suggestions for everyone else. When she called in private security, I didn't flinch. I knew the law and I knew my rights. They arrived in black vests and mirrored sunglasses, a spectacle meant to intimidate. Yet, even their presence couldn't hide the shaky confidence in her eyes. Law enforcement arrived quietly, professional, and after reviewing the situation, they made it clear where reality stood. They sided with me. Every command Brenda barked, every threat, dissolved into nothing more than hot air. Her own board members exchanged glances, whispers passing between them like a current of doubt. The room that used to rally behind her now felt smaller, as if her authority had been pulled out from under her. Questions rose. Complaints were noted. Her carefully constructed facade of control began to crumble in real time. Neighbors who had once nodded politely now paused in their routines to watch, murmuring in corners. Brenda had underestimated the power of observation, of documentation. Every action she took, every reckless assertion, became part of the narrative forming in plain sight. The community was watching, and for the first time, her actions were being questioned openly, without fear of reprisal. I moved deliberately, filing and serving the notices. Each one was precise, legally airtight, impossible to ignore. 72 hours now began, a countdown that Brenda had no control over. It was more than a timer, it was a shift in the balance of power. The pressure she had tried to place on me was now mirrored back onto her, compressed into those 3 days. There would be no shortcuts, no bending the rules. Just the law, the records, and the watchful eyes of a neighborhood that refused to be bullied. In those 72 hours, everything changed. The whispers grew into conversations. Board members asked questions they had once avoided. Brenda's own tactics, meant to intimidate and isolate, became the very evidence that undermined her. By the time the countdown ended, the storm she tried to conjure had turned inward, exposing cracks in her control and sowing doubt among those she had relied on to enforce her will. Every step I had taken was deliberate: document, notify, stand firm. Brenda's escalation had been swift and dramatic, but the law, community scrutiny, and careful planning created a wall she couldn't bulldoze. The shift was subtle yet unmistakable. By the time those 72 hours expired, the narrative had flipped completely. What had been a theater of fear became a quiet affirmation of rights, a lesson in accountability, and a reminder that power untempered by law is fragile. The pressure cooker had reached its limit, and Brenda was left standing amid the steam of her own making. The air felt lighter, the street calmer, the board's questions louder than her threats. And in that quiet aftermath, I realized that control isn't taken with boots or security or loud declarations. It's built slowly, legally, and with patience. Brenda had acted fast, but I had acted right, and in the end that made all the difference. The fourth day arrived like a quiet warning. The sun was just brushing the tops of the trees when Rivera Towing rolled onto the street. One truck, then another, then a dozen, lined up with the kind of precision that made the whole block feel like it had been surveyed by a general. Engines hummed in unison, their presence undeniable. This was no casual tow. It was an orchestrated operation, deliberate, unstoppable. Brenda's luxury SUV sat smugly in the driveway, a symbol of her assumed invincibility. She had paraded it around like it made her untouchable. But as the first tow truck rolled forward, her expression changed. Shock, confusion, then panic. She screamed a high-pitched, desperate sound, half outrage, half terror, but no one paid it any mind. The drivers ignored her, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. She waved papers at the deputy, documents she hoped would make them stop. She lied loudly, claiming emergency authority, ownership disputes, anything that might freeze the operation in its tracks. But the deputy's eyes were calm, unflinching, the law in his pocket and common sense on his side. He confirmed every action, every tow, was perfectly legal. The papers she waved were meaningless, a bluff that couldn't survive the weight of truth and procedure. By mid-morning, the numbers were staggering. 58 vehicles, from sedans to SUVs, had been cleared. Driveways, streets, and alleys once cluttered were now open, the transformation both shocking and undeniable. Neighbors came out of their homes, some in pajamas, others clutching coffee cups, all watching with wide eyes as what had seemed impossible unfolded before them. Murmurs ran like electricity through the block. Who had the right? Who could do this? How had it all been allowed? News crews arrived, cameras rolling, microphones extended, capturing every angle. The story had escaped the confines of our street, spreading like wildfire through local feeds. Reporters asked questions, neighbors offered statements, and Brenda's frantic protests only made her look smaller. Every lie she had told, every threat she had made, crumbled under the bright scrutiny of cameras and witnesses. It wasn't just about the cars. It was about authority, about the difference between assumed power and legitimate power. Brenda had relied on intimidation, on waving imaginary rules like a sword. But authority backed by law, procedure, and community support was something else entirely. Immovable, undeniable. That was what she was witnessing now, and the realization hit her like a punch. Her control was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable order. By late morning, the street was empty of the vehicles that had once seemed permanent. The neighbors lingered, talking in low tones, sharing relief and disbelief. Some offered smiles of solidarity, others simply shook their heads. Brenda stood in the middle of it all, her hands trembling, her face flushed. Finally seeing the world she had tried to control from the wrong side of the law. The lesson was clear, even to the wider audience watching through cameras and social feeds. Authority isn't about fear. It isn't about shouting, paperwork, or private security. It's about knowing your rights, following procedure, and acting with patience and precision. Brenda had escalated, attempted to manipulate, and ultimately failed. The neighborhood had witnessed it all, and for the first time, she understood the scale of what she had underestimated. By the time the last tow truck drove away, a quiet settled over the street. It wasn't just the absence of vehicles. It was the affirmation of accountability. Brenda's screaming had faded into the background, replaced by murmurs of admiration for the neighbors who stood their ground and the professionals who executed the law flawlessly. Authority, real authority, had arrived, and Brenda could do nothing but watch it operate. It was over. The climax had played out in full, public, undeniable detail, and Brenda finally understood the one truth she had resisted for so long. Control isn't claimed through fear or bluster. It is earned, structured, and recognized through action that aligns with law, logic, and the support of a community unwilling to be bullied. That day, the street changed forever, not just in its appearance, but in its balance of power. The aftermath hit the neighborhood like a wave that couldn't be stopped. What had started as a confrontation over trucks and blocked driveways evolved into something far bigger. Criminal investigations were launched almost immediately. Brenda's aggressive tactics, her claims of emergency authority, and her orchestration of intimidation came under scrutiny. Deputies and city investigators combed through records, notes, and communications. Every false claim, every forged document, and every attempt to leverage fear was documented, a mountain of evidence she had no way to erase. Financial audits followed. The HOA's books, which Brenda had controlled with an iron fist, were open to accountants and city officials. It didn't take long for discrepancies to appear. Funds allocated for legitimate community needs had been diverted for personal vendettas. Receipts didn't match bank statements. Contracts were missing signatures, approvals were questionable, and policies had been ignored for years. The sloppy bookkeeping revealed a pattern of mismanagement that left the board vulnerable and the community furious. The fallout rippled through the HOA leadership. Board members who had once nodded in silence now resigned one by one. Some cited personal reasons, but it was clear the pressure, the scrutiny, and the legal implications made continuing untenable. Their authority had been fragile, propped up by fear and Brenda's dominance, and when her control collapsed, theirs followed immediately. The HOA's formation itself came under question. Documents that were supposed to establish legitimacy were incomplete, missing, or borderline invalid. For years, they had operated on assumptions and gaps in the law, and now the law had caught up. Brenda herself became a figure of controversy. Public records, news stories, and eyewitness accounts exposed her actions in a way that made further residence in the neighborhood impossible. Within weeks, she packed her belongings, sold her home, and moved away. There were no dramatic confrontations, no last-minute threats, just a quiet departure. The echo of her footsteps replaced by a neighborhood slowly returning to normal. Her absence was immediate relief, a visible shift in the energy of the street. Neighbors began to speak more freely, cautiously at first, then with a growing sense of community. Apologies were offered to those who had been intimidated, reassurances shared that the neighborhood could and would stand together. Conversations that had been whispered behind closed doors now became open discussions about accountability, legal boundaries, and respect. The tension that had hung over the street for months gradually lifted, replaced by cautious optimism and quiet camaraderie. Property values, which had dipped under the weight of conflict and mismanagement, began to recover. Listings that had stalled for months now moved, sales completed, and the street slowly regained its appeal. Prospective buyers could see a neighborhood that had endured chaos but emerged stronger. The combination of legal resolution, community oversight, and restored order reassured everyone that stability had returned. Peace settled like a gentle fog over the streets. The aggressive confrontations, the shouting matches, the looming threat of authority wielded recklessly. Those were memories now, lessons rather than ongoing stress. Life returned to normal rhythms. Children played in yards, homeowners maintained gardens without fear, and board meetings, when held, were procedural and calm rather than arenas of intimidation. The story of those months became a cautionary tale. It wasn't just about Brenda or the HOA. It was about accountability, the power of documentation, and the strength of a community united under law and common sense. Those who had once watched silently now spoke up, ensuring that future conflicts would be handled openly, legally, and fairly. And while the tension that had defined that period was gone, the lessons lingered. Authority, real authority, had been tested and demonstrated, not through bluster or threats, but through law, preparation, and persistence. Brenda's departure, the resignations, the audits, and the exposure of sloppy governance all underscored a single truth: communities thrive when accountability is clear, rights are respected, and abuses are confronted firmly and legally. By the end of it, the neighborhood was not just restored, it was stronger. The peace that returned was quieter, steadier, and earned. What had been a nightmare of intimidation and fear became a story of resilience, law, and order. The street was calm again, but this time it carried a subtle confidence, the knowledge that when authority is abused, it can and will be challenged. The road was the same as it had always been. Same foundation, same alignment, same ownership. Nothing had shifted in the asphalt or the curves, yet everything around it felt different. What had changed wasn't the road itself, it was the silence that followed. No more clipboards, no more shouting, no more fake authority flexed like it could bend reality. Just neighbors breathing, walking their yards, laughing a little louder, and finally feeling safe in the place they called home. The tension that had clung to every fence, every corner, had lifted, replaced by a calm that felt earned, not granted. HOAs only have power when people give it to them without question. When someone stands firm, documents everything, and waits for the law to do its work, that power evaporates. Documentation beats intimidation. Patience beats noise. And sometimes, the quiet neighbor, the one no one notices, turns out to be the most formidable force of all. That street didn't just survive Brenda's storm. It learned, it healed, it grew stronger, and the lesson was clear for anyone paying attention: authority without accountability is fragile, but courage and preparation are lasting. If you want to hear more true stories like this, hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And don't be shy. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?